It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night in October 2021, and I was rolling eastbound on I-80 through Wyoming with a load of electronics bound for Chicago. I'd been driving for Schneider for about 8 years at that point, had over 1 million safe miles under my belt, and thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. The weather was clear, traffic was non-existent, and I was making good time with my 14-hour clock still showing 4 hours left before my mandatory break. I was somewhere between Laramie and Cheyenne, cruising through that empty stretch where cell towers are scarce, and the only light comes from your own headlights cutting through the darkness. The CB had been quiet for the last hour, not even the usual chatter from other drivers. Just the steady hum of my Cummins engine and the rhythmic thump of my tires hitting the expansion joints in the concrete. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a figure on the shoulder, thumb out, the universal sign for needing a ride. Now, I'd been driving long enough to know the golden rule: never pick up hitchhikers. Company policy forbids it. Insurance won't cover incidents involving passengers, and frankly, you never know what kind of trouble you're inviting into your cab. But something about this guy made me slow down. He was wearing what looked like an old military jacket, desert camouflage that had seen better days. Tall, maybe 6'2", with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. As my headlights swept over him, I could see he was young, probably early 20s, with short-cropped hair and a clean-shaven face. He didn't look like the usual roadside drifters I'd encountered over the years. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed in 8 years of long-haul trucking told me to keep my foot on the accelerator and leave him in my mirrors. But maybe it was the isolation of that stretch of highway, or the fact that I'd been a young soldier myself once, but I found myself downshifting and pulling onto the shoulder about 100 yards past him. Through my passenger side mirror, I watched him jog toward the truck, his movement smooth and confident. He climbed up to my passenger door without hesitation, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he settled into the passenger seat. His voice was calm, polite, with just a hint of a southern accent. "Most drivers don't stop anymore." "Yeah, well, company policy and all that," I replied, putting the truck back in gear. "But it's a cold night out there. Where you headed?" "Denver," he said, adjusting his duffel bag between his feet. "Got family there. Been trying to get home for a while now." I nodded, focusing on merging back into the eastbound lane. "Denver's not on my route, but I can get you closer. I'm stopping at the Flying J in Cheyenne for fuel. You can probably catch another ride from there." "That'd be great," he said. "Really appreciate it." For the next 20 miles, we made small talk. He told me his name was Marcus, said he'd just finished his deployment in Afghanistan and was making his way back to civilian life. He asked about trucking, seemed genuinely interested in the lifestyle, the routes, the different types of freight we haul. Normal conversation, the kind you'd expect from a polite young veteran trying to get home. But small things started bothering me. First, it was the way he knew about trucking regulations. When I mentioned my hours of service, he nodded knowingly and said something about the new ELD requirements that had just gone into effect. Most civilians don't know about electronic logging devices, but Marcus spoke about them like he'd been around truckers for years. Then there was his knowledge of the route. When I mentioned taking Highway 85 south toward Denver, he shook his head and said, "Nah, that construction project's still backing up traffic. You'd want to take 25 south instead." The thing is, I'd driven through that area just 2 weeks earlier, and there was no construction. Highway 85 was clear. But the thing that really got my attention was when he started talking about other drivers he'd ridden with. He mentioned Jimmy Kowalski, a driver for Prime who ran the I-80 corridor regularly. He described Jimmy's truck down to the custom paint job and the stuffed bear hanging from the CB. He knew that Jimmy's wife had been sick, that he'd been taking shorter runs to stay closer to home. I knew Jimmy personally. We'd been convoy buddies for years, talked regularly on the CB, even shared a few meals at truck stops along our routes. and Jimmy had been killed in a rollover accident outside of Salt Lake City 6 months earlier. "How do you know Jimmy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Marcus paused for a moment, staring out the windshield at the dark highway ahead. "Rode with him a few times. Good guy. Really cared about getting home to his family." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "When was the last time you saw him?" "Oh, not too long ago," Marcus said. "Maybe a month or two back. He was heading west, said he had a load of steel coils for California." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Jimmy had been dead for 6 months, and steel coils were exactly what he'd been hauling when his truck rolled. The accident report said he'd been westbound on Interstate 80, just like Marcus described. I reached for my CB radio, switching to Channel 19. "Breaker 19, this is Road Dog running eastbound at the 348 marker. Anyone out there copy?" The radio crackled with static. Then a familiar voice came through. "Road Dog, this is Moonshine running westbound about 10 miles ahead of you. What's your 20? "Just past mile marker 348, Moonshine. You know a driver named Jimmy Kowalski, drives for Prime." There was a long pause before Moonshine responded. "Jimmy?" "Hell, Road Dog, Jimmy's been dead for months. Rolled his truck near Salt Lake. Why you asking?" I glanced over at Marcus. He was sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead, but I could see a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just wondering," I said into the CB. "Thanks for the info, Moonshine." "Everything all right out there, Road Dog?" I looked at Marcus again. He turned to meet my gaze, and for just a moment, his eyes seemed to reflect the green glow of my dashboard lights in a way that wasn't quite right. "Yeah, everything's fine," I lied into the CB. "Catch you on the flip side." The miles crawled by in silence after that. Marcus didn't speak, just sat there with that slight smile, occasionally nodding as if he could hear something I couldn't. The CB remained eerily quiet despite the fact that I-80 usually had steady chatter from drivers running their overnight routes. When we reached the Flying J in Cheyenne, I pulled into the truck stop and parked near the fuel islands. The place was busier than usual for a Tuesday night, with maybe a dozen trucks scattered around the lot. "This is where I need to fuel up," I told Marcus. "You can probably find another ride from here." "Sure thing," he said, grabbing his duffel bag. "Thanks for the ride. Really appreciate a driver willing to help out a fellow veteran." He climbed down from the cab and started walking toward the truck stop building. I watched him in my mirrors until he disappeared around the corner near the driver's lounge. Something still felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I fueled up, checked my tires, and went inside to grab a coffee and use the restroom. The place was busy for the middle of the night, with drivers coming and going, the usual mix of conversations and CB chatter. I asked the clerk at the counter if he'd seen a young guy in a military jacket looking for a ride. "Military jacket?" the clerk asked, looking confused. "Haven't seen anyone like that tonight, just the usual crowd." I described Marcus in detail: tall, clean-shaven, desert camo jacket, duffel bag. The clerk shook his head. "Nope, definitely haven't seen anyone matching that description. Been here all night." That's when I started talking to other drivers. I asked 5 or 6 guys if they'd seen Marcus, described him the same way each time. None of them had seen anyone like that. More than that, they all gave me the same strange look, like they were concerned about my mental state. I walked the entire truck stop lot, checking behind every trailer, looking in the driver's lounge, even checking the restaurant. No sign of Marcus anywhere. Back at my truck, I did a thorough walk around, checking every compartment, looking under the trailer, even climbing up to inspect my fifth wheel. Everything was secure, nothing missing, no sign that anyone had tampered with my rig. But when I climbed back into my cab, I found something on the passenger seat that made my blood run cold. It was a small metal object, about the size of a quarter. When I picked it up and examined it under my dome light, I realized it was a military dog tag. The name stamped into the metal read Wright Marcus J, with a service number and blood type. But it wasn't new. The edges were worn, the metal tarnished with age. And there was something else stamped at the bottom that made my hands shake as I read it. KIA, October 15th, 2003. Killed in action. October 15th, 2003. 18 years ago. I sat in that truck stop parking lot for another hour, staring at that dog tag, trying to make sense of what had happened. I'd had a 20-minute conversation with a dead man. He'd known details about Jimmy Kowalski that no living person should have known. He'd disappeared without a trace in a crowded truck stop where the clerk and half a dozen drivers swore they never saw him. I never reported it. What would I have said? That I picked up a ghost on I-80? That a dead soldier had hitched a ride in my truck? Instead, I kept that dog tag, and I started asking other drivers if they'd ever had any strange experiences on that stretch of Wyoming highway. Turns out, I wasn't the first. Over the next few months, I heard variations of the same story from 4 different drivers. Always the same stretch of Interstate 80 between Laramie and Cheyenne. Always a young man in military gear looking for a ride to Denver. Always polite, knowledgeable about trucking, always asking about family back home, and always gone without a trace at the next truck stop. One driver, an old-timer named Pete who'd been running that route for 30 years, told me something that still gives me chills. He'd picked up Marcus twice, 10 years apart. Same guy, same jacket, same duffel bag, same conversation about getting home to Denver. Pete said the second time he recognized him immediately but didn't say anything, just gave him the ride like before. Some folks just can't find their way home, Pete told me, even after they die. I still run I-80 through Wyoming, but I don't stop for hitchhikers anymore. And whenever I pass that stretch between Laramie and Cheyenne late at night, I keep my CB on and my eyes straight ahead. Because sometimes, when the moon is dark and the highway is empty, you might see a figure on the shoulder with his thumb out, still trying to get home to a family that's been waiting 18 years for him to walk through the door. The dog tag is still in my glove compartment. I figure, when my time comes to hang up the keys for good, I'll drive out to that stretch of highway and leave it where I picked him up. Maybe that'll help Marcus finally find his way home. Or maybe it'll just give him something familiar to hold on to while he waits for the next trucker with a soft heart and a warm cab to help a fellow veteran make it through another cold Wyoming night. It was supposed to be a straightforward delivery run to Detroit. Nothing complicated, nothing suspicious, just 40,000 pounds of automotive parts heading to a warehouse on the city's east side. I'd been hauling freight for Werner Enterprises for 12 years, and Detroit was familiar territory. I'd made dozens of runs to the Motor City without incident, but this particular load in March 2023 was different from the moment I picked up the paperwork. The dispatch came through late on a Friday afternoon, which should have been my first red flag. Most legitimate automotive shipments are scheduled days or weeks in advance, not thrown together at the last minute on a weekend. But the rate was good, almost too good, and I needed the miles to hit my monthly bonus. The pickup was clean, a sealed trailer from a parts manufacturer in Indiana that I'd worked with before. The paperwork looked legitimate, complete with proper seals and customs documentation. The delivery address was what started bothering me during the drive. Instead of one of the major automotive plants or established warehouses I usually delivered to, this was going to something called Midwest Industrial Solutions, at an address in a part of Detroit I wasn't familiar with. When I tried to look it up online during my mandatory break, the company had no website, no reviews, nothing that suggested it was a legitimate business. I arrived at the address around 11 p.m., right on schedule according to my appointment time. The building was in an industrial district that had seen better days, cracked concrete, broken streetlights, and half the warehouses looking abandoned. The one I was looking for sat at the end of a dead-end street surrounded by a chain-link fence with razor wire across the top. A faded sign by the gate read Midwest Industrial, but the paint was peeling and the whole place had an abandoned feel to it. The strange thing was the gate was already open, even though my appointment wasn't until midnight. I pulled up to the guard shack, expecting to check in with security, but it was empty. A handwritten note taped to the window said, Bay 7. back dock, with an arrow pointing around the building. I followed the arrow, driving slowly through the empty lot. The asphalt was cracked and potholed, forcing me to navigate carefully to avoid damaging my trailer. As I rounded the corner, I could see the loading docks, 10 bays total, but only one had lights on. Bay 7, just like the note said. 3 men were waiting for me, which seemed like overkill for unloading automotive parts. Usually, one guy with a forklift could handle a trailer like mine in an hour. These weren't typical warehouse workers either. They wore mismatched clothes, jeans, work boots, and heavy jackets despite the warm spring weather. No company uniforms, no safety gear, no hard hats or reflective vests that you'd expect at a legitimate operation. I backed up to the dock and set my brakes, then climbed down to meet them. The apparent leader was a stocky man in his 50s, with graying hair and arms covered in tattoos that looked like prison work. He introduced himself as Frank and asked for my paperwork. "Running a little behind schedule," Frank said, glancing at the bills of lading. "We'll get you unloaded quick." That's when the first real red flag went up. The paperwork I'd been given showed automotive parts, but Frank was looking at a completely different set of documents, ones I'd never seen before. When I pointed this out, he waved it off. "Dispatch error," he said. "Happens all the time. Don't worry about it." But I was worried. In 12 years of trucking, I'd never had a shipper mix up paperwork like that. I asked to see the correct bills of lading, but Frank said they were inside and he'd get them after we finished unloading. The unloading process itself was all wrong. Instead of using a forklift to remove palletized parts, they were hand-carrying boxes out of my trailer. Heavy boxes that took 2 men to lift, and they were being very careful not to drop or jostle them. When I tried to get a closer look at what they were removing, Frank stepped in front of me. "Insurance liability," he said. "Can't have drivers in the work area while we're unloading." I was directed to wait in their office, which was a mobile trailer parked near the loading docks. The inside looked like a construction site office, folding chairs, a card table, and papers scattered everywhere. But what caught my attention were the multiple cell phones charging on the table, each one a different model and carrier. The kind of setup you'd expect from people who needed to stay off the grid. While I waited, I tried calling Werner Dispatch to verify the delivery details. No answer. The night dispatcher should have been available 24/7. I tried the shipper's emergency number. Disconnected. I even tried calling the warehouse number that was on my original paperwork, but it went straight to voicemail with a generic greeting. That's when I heard the first gunshot. It was muffled, coming from somewhere inside the warehouse, but unmistakable. I'd been in the Army before I started trucking, and I knew the sound of firearms. A few seconds later, there was another shot, then voices shouting in what sounded like Spanish. I was reaching for my CB radio when Frank walked into the trailer office, followed by one of the other men. Both had pistols tucked into their waistbands, not even trying to hide them anymore. "Change of plans," Frank said, closing the door behind him. "We need you to make another pickup before you leave." "I don't think so," I said, standing up and moving toward the door. "Just finish unloading my trailer and I'll be on my way." The second man, younger and twitchy, pulled his gun and pointed it at my chest. "Sit down." Frank shot him an angry look. "Put that away, you idiot. We don't need complications." But the damage was done. I now knew for certain that I'd walked into something way beyond a simple delivery mix-up. Whatever had been in my trailer wasn't automotive parts, and these weren't legitimate warehouse workers. "Look," Frank said, trying to sound reasonable, "we've got a business arrangement with your dispatcher. You pick up a load from us, deliver it to Chicago, everybody gets paid. Simple as that." "What kind of load?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. "The kind you don't ask questions about," Frank replied. I played along, nodding like I was considering it while scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon or a way out. The windows were too small to crawl through, and both men were between me and the door, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They hadn't taken my CB radio or cell phone. "All right," I said, sitting back down. but I need to call dispatch and let them know about the schedule change. Frank nodded. Make it quick. Instead of calling dispatch, I switched my CB to Channel 9, the emergency frequency monitored by police and highway patrol. I keyed the mic and started talking in trucker code, hoping any listening law enforcement would understand. Breaker 9, this is Eastbound Express requesting immediate assistance at the Midwest Industrial Dock on Harper Avenue. Got a situation with some freight handlers that ain't looking too friendly. Could use some backup ASAP. Frank lunged for the radio, but I was already transmitting again. Shots fired, armed subjects, requesting immediate police response to Harper Avenue Warehouse District. The younger man raised his gun again, but Frank grabbed his arm. You fire that thing, and every cop in Detroit will be here in 5 minutes. He was right, and apparently, my emergency call had been heard. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. Frank cursed and ran outside, shouting orders to the other men. I heard engines starting and vehicles racing away from the warehouse. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found me sitting in that trailer office, still holding my CB radio. The warehouse was empty except for my partially unloaded trailer and a few boxes scattered around the dock. Whatever operation had been running there, they'd cleared out fast when they heard the sirens. The investigating detective told me I'd stumbled into what they suspected was a drug transshipment operation. The legitimate shipping company had been compromised. Someone on the inside was diverting certain loads to fake warehouses where the cargo was swapped out. Drivers like me were unwitting mules, carrying drugs and weapons between cities, while thinking we were hauling legitimate freight. The scariest part was how close I'd come to becoming an accessory to federal crimes without even knowing it. If I'd accepted that pickup Frank wanted me to make, I could have ended up facing trafficking charges that would have destroyed my career and sent me to prison for decades. Werner terminated my employment 2 weeks later. They claimed it was for failure to follow company security protocols, but I knew the real reason. I'd become a liability, a driver who'd seen too much and asked too many questions. The trucking industry runs on trust and routine, and when that routine gets disrupted by federal investigations, companies would rather cut their losses. I've been driving for a smaller outfit ever since, but I'm a lot more careful about the loads I accept. I verify every shipper and receiver before I pick up freight. I never deliver to an address I can't verify online, and I always trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. Because the truth is, legitimate businesses don't operate out of abandoned warehouses at midnight. They don't have armed guards who can't show you proper paperwork. And they definitely don't try to force drivers into making unscheduled pickups at gunpoint. The highway might seem like a place where only traffic laws matter, but there's a whole criminal network operating parallel to legitimate commerce. Sometimes, the only thing standing between a driver and a federal prison cell is the willingness to ask questions and the courage to call for help when those questions don't get good answers. The CB radio has always been a trucker's best friend. In 15 years behind the wheel, I've used mine to get traffic reports, find the cheapest fuel, and share stories with other drivers during those long, lonely stretches between cities. It's a lifeline that connects you to a community of people who understand the isolation of life on the road. But in the spring of 2023, that same radio became the tool someone used to turn my life into a nightmare. It started innocently enough on a run from Phoenix to Atlanta in early April. I was pulling a load of electronics, making good time on Interstate 40 through Arkansas, when I keyed up my CB to check for smoky reports ahead. Breaker 19. This is Roadrunner eastbound at the 280-mile marker. Anyone got ears on for traffic reports? Roadrunner, this is Nighthawk, came the reply. The voice was smooth, confident, with just a hint of a southern drawl. Got you covered, driver. Clear sailing for the next 50 miles, but there's a bear in the bushes at the 340 marker. Four-wheeler got tagged about an hour ago. Much appreciated, Nighthawk. Catch you on the flip side. Standard CB chatter, the kind of helpful exchange that happens thousands of times a day across the highway system. Nighthawk seemed like any other experienced driver, professional, knowledgeable about the routes, and willing to help a fellow trucker avoid speed traps and traffic jams. Over the next few weeks, I'd hear from Nighthawk regularly. He seemed to run similar routes to mine, always eastbound or westbound on the major interstates. He'd warn me about construction zones, recommend good truck stops, and occasionally we'd chat about the industry during those dead hours when the highways were empty and sleep was still miles away. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conversation started feeling different. "How's that freight liner running, Roadrunner?" he asked one night somewhere in Missouri. "That 2019 Cascadia's a nice rig. Bet she handles well with a full load." I'd never told him what kind of truck I drove. Most drivers don't volunteer that information unless they're comparing rigs or talking about mechanical issues. I brushed it off, figuring he might have seen my truck at a truck stop or caught my company logo during a pass on the highway. Then came the personal details. "Roadrunner, you heading home to Tucson after this run?" he asked during a conversation near Oklahoma City. "Wife's probably missing you after 3 weeks out here." My blood went cold. I'd never mentioned where I lived or that I was married. That information wasn't public, wasn't in any driver directory, and certainly wasn't something I'd shared over an open CB channel where anyone could be listening. "How do you know that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, you mentioned it a while back," Nighthawk replied with a chuckle. "You know how these long conversations go. Sometimes you forget what you've told people. But I knew I hadn't mentioned it. I'd been driving long enough to know better than to share personal information with strangers on the radio. The CB might feel like a private conversation, but it's broadcasting to anyone within range who happens to be listening on that channel." I started paying closer attention to Nighthawk's calls after that. He always seemed to know where I was, what routes I was running, even when I was taking my mandatory rest breaks. If I was parked at a truck stop for my 10-hour break, he'd key up around the time I was getting ready to roll again. "Morning, Roadrunner. Ready to hit the road? That Flying J in Little Rock's got good coffee, but their showers are overpriced." He was right about the Flying J, but I'd never told him where I was parked. The calls started coming on different channels, too. If I switched from 19 to 17 to avoid the chatter, Nighthawk would follow. He'd pop up on 10, on 15, even on some of the lesser-used channels that most drivers ignored. It was like he was scanning constantly, waiting for me to key up anywhere on the band. 3 weeks into this pattern, I was parked at a small truck stop outside Memphis when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my truck, taken from across the parking lot while I was inside getting dinner. The timestamp showed it had been taken just 20 minutes earlier. There was no message with the photo, but I didn't need one to understand what it meant. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I called the truck stop security, but they said their cameras didn't cover that section of the lot. I filed a report with local police, but they said it wasn't enough to constitute a threat, just a photo of a truck in a public place. That night, as I was settling into my sleeper berth, Nighthawk's voice crackled through my CB speaker. "Sweet dreams, Roadrunner. You look tired tonight." I grabbed the handset. "Who is this?" "What do you want?" "Just a friend looking out for you," came the reply. "Roads can be dangerous for a driver who's not careful." I turned off my CB and tried to sleep, but every sound outside my truck had me on edge. Footsteps on gravel, car doors slamming, the hiss of air brakes from other trucks. Everything seemed like a potential threat. The next morning, I found something slipped under my windshield wiper. It was a printout of my electronic logging device data, my exact route, stop times, and driving hours for the previous week. Information that should have been accessible only to me, my dispatcher, and DOT inspectors. That's when I realized this wasn't just some creepy trucker with too much time on his hands. This was someone with access to digital systems, someone who could hack into company databases and track my movements in real time. I called my dispatcher and explained what was happening. They seemed skeptical at first, but when I forwarded them the ELD printout, Their tone changed quickly. Within hours, I had a new truck number, new electronic logs, and instructions to vary my routes and stops until they could figure out how the security breach had occurred. But Nighthawk adapted too. Within 2 days, he was back on the radio, addressing me by my new call sign, somehow still tracking my movements despite all the precautions. The breaking point came during a run through West Texas. I was parked at a rest area trying to get some sleep before the final push to El Paso when I heard voices outside my truck. 2 men were talking quietly near my trailer, discussing my cargo and delivery schedule in detail they couldn't have known without inside information. I crept to my sleeper window and caught a glimpse of them. One tall and thin, the other shorter and stocky, both wearing dark clothing. The shorter one was holding what looked like a GPS tracker, trying to find a place to attach it to my trailer. I grabbed my CB and switched to Channel 9, the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday. This is Roadrunner at the rest area mile marker 85 on I-10 westbound. 2 suspicious individuals attempting to tamper with my vehicle. Request immediate police assistance. The men heard my transmission and ran for their car, speeding away before I could get a good look at their license plate. But I'd had enough. Whatever this was, it had escalated beyond harassment into something that felt like a direct threat to my safety. State police arrived within 15 minutes and took my statement. They found evidence that someone had been tampering with trucks at that rest area. Scratches around trailer brake lines and electrical connections. Attempts to install tracking devices, even small holes drilled in fuel tanks. The trooper told me I wasn't the first driver to report being followed or monitored. They'd had similar complaints from 5 other truckers over the past month, all involving someone using the handle Nighthawk on CB radio. We think it's someone targeting specific drivers for cargo theft, the trooper explained. They track your routes, learn your patterns, then either rob you directly or sell the information to hijacking crews. With the help of my company's security department and federal investigators, we set up a sting operation. I continued my normal routes while wearing a wire and using a modified CB that could triangulate Nighthawk's signal. For 3 weeks, I played along with his conversations while law enforcement tracked his transmissions. They finally caught him at a truck stop outside Dallas. Timothy Mitchell, a former trucker who'd lost his CDL after a DUI conviction. He'd been using a high-powered CB base station and hacked electronic logging device software to monitor dozens of drivers, selling their route information to cargo theft rings for $500 per truck. But Mitchell wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger network that included corrupt dispatchers at trucking companies, truck stop employees who installed tracking devices, and organized theft crews who used the information to steal millions of dollars worth of cargo every year. The investigation led to 14 arrests across 6 states. Mitchell got 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, stalking, and conspiracy to commit cargo theft. I thought that would be the end of it, but the damage was already done. Even knowing Nighthawk was behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd installed additional locks on my truck, changed my routes constantly, and avoided the truck stops where I'd been monitored. The worst part was losing faith in the CB radio community that had been such an important part of trucking culture. Now every friendly voice offering traffic updates or route advice felt like a potential threat. The simple pleasure of chatting with other drivers during long nighttime hauls was gone, replaced by paranoia and suspicion. I still use my CB for safety and traffic information, but I'm careful about what I share. I never mention my real name, my home city, or my destination. I vary my call signs and avoid the patterns that made me a target in the first place. Because the truth is, the technology that makes modern trucking more efficient also makes drivers more vulnerable. Our electronic logs, GPS systems, and communication devices create digital footprints that can be exploited by people with criminal intentions. Nighthawk taught me that the voice on the other end of the radio might not be who they claim to be, And sometimes the person offering to help you navigate the dangerous roads ahead is the most dangerous part of the journey. It was supposed to be a routine compliance stop, just another DOT inspection on the long haul from Houston to Phoenix. I'd been driving for Crete Carrier for 8 years, had a spotless safety record, and my 2020 Peterbilt 579 was always kept in perfect condition. Weigh stations were just part of the job. Pull in, show your papers, maybe get your logs checked, and roll on down the road. But on that cold February night in 2023, what looked like a standard DOT checkpoint nearly became my grave. I was westbound on Interstate 10 through the desert between El Paso and Tucson, hauling a load of automotive parts worth about $180,000. The highway was mostly empty at 2 a.m., just the occasional car and scattered big rigs making their overnight runs. My electronic log showed I had 6 hours left on my drive clock, plenty of time to reach my delivery appointment in Phoenix the next morning. That's when I saw the orange cones and flashing lights ahead. The setup looked official enough at first glance. Portable signs directing commercial vehicles to the right lane. Orange traffic cones creating a funnel toward what appeared to be a temporary inspection station. A large banner stretched between two poles read, "A DOT Commercial Vehicle Enforcement, Random Safety Inspection." But something about the whole operation felt wrong from the moment I started slowing down. Real weigh stations have permanent structures, electronic signs that display open or closed, and standardized federal highway markings. This looked more like a construction zone that someone had converted into an inspection point. The lighting was all wrong too. Instead of the bright, even illumination you'd expect at an official facility, this place was lit by portable work lights that cast harsh shadows and left dark corners everywhere. I downshifted and pulled into the inspection lane, following the hand signals from a man wearing what looked like a DOT uniform. But as I got closer, the details started bothering me. His shirt was the wrong shade of blue. His badge looked like something you could buy online, and instead of the standard DOT enforcement cap, he was wearing a generic baseball hat with no agency logo. "Evening, driver," he said as I rolled down my window. "Routine safety inspection tonight. Let me see your CDL, medical card, and logbook." I handed over my documents, but something in his tone set me on edge. Real DOT officers are usually professional but polite, not overly friendly, but not hostile either. This guy had an edge to his voice, like he was trying too hard to sound official. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he said after glancing at my paperwork. "We need to do a walk-around inspection." That's when I really started paying attention to my surroundings. There were 4 men total, the one talking to me, and 3 others conducting inspections on 2 other trucks that had been pulled over. But their inspection techniques were all wrong. Instead of checking brake, components, and tire tread depth like real DOT officers would do, they seemed more interested in looking inside cargo areas and asking drivers about their loads. I climbed down from my cab and followed the fake officer around my truck. He carried a clipboard and tried to look like he knew what he was doing, but he spent more time examining my cargo doors than my brake lines. When he asked me to open the trailer so he could verify the load, every alarm bell in my head started ringing. "I'm going to need to see your DOT enforcement credentials," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Company policy requires me to verify the identity of any officer who wants to inspect my cargo." His friendly demeanor vanished instantly. "Driver, you're required by federal law to comply with DOT inspections. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." But I'd been through dozens of real inspections over the years, and I knew the procedures. DOT officers don't usually ask to inspect cargo unless there's a specific safety concern, or they have reasonable suspicion of a violation, and they always carry proper credentials that they're required to show upon request. I pulled out my CB handset and switched to channel 19. "Breaker 19, this is Desert Freighter westbound on Interstate 10 at mile marker 318. Any drivers been through the DOT checkpoint here tonight?" Static filled the radio for a few seconds. Then a voice crackled through. "Desert Freighter, this is Moondog eastbound." Passed that marker about an hour ago. Didn't see any DOT checkpoint. What's your 20 again? Mile marker 318, westbound side. They've got a full inspection setup running. Negative, driver. I run this route twice a week, never seen a checkpoint at that location. You might want to be careful. The fake officer lunged for my CB handset, but I pulled it back toward the cab. What's the problem, officer? Just checking with other drivers about road conditions. Turn off that radio, he snarled, and now I could see the other 3 men moving toward us. One of them had his hand inside his jacket, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't reaching for an inspection form. I keyed the CB again, this time switching to Channel 9, the emergency frequency monitored by state police. Emergency, emergency. This is Desert Freighter, CDL number TXC547291. Being held at bogus DOT checkpoint on I-10, westbound mile marker 318. Request immediate law enforcement assistance. 4 subjects posing as DOT officers attempting to access cargo. The response from the fake officers was immediate and violent. The leader grabbed my arm and tried to wrestle the CB away from me while one of the others shouted, "Take him down." I yanked my arm free and dove back into my cab, slamming the door and hitting the locks. Through my windshield, I could see the other 2 truckers, who'd been inspected, were now surrounded by the fake officers, hands raised, obviously being robbed. I fired up my Caterpillar engine and shifted into first gear, but one of the fake officers jumped in front of my truck, waving his arms and yelling for me to stop. I laid on my air horn and kept rolling. He dove out of the way at the last second, and I heard him screaming obscenities as I accelerated past him. In my mirrors, I could see them running for their vehicles, a black SUV and a pickup truck that had been hidden behind the portable inspection setup. They were going to chase me, and I had a 400-mile disadvantage in a vehicle that topped out at 70 miles per hour. I grabbed my CB and started transmitting on every channel I could find. Mayday, Mayday, this is Desert Freighter, Peterbilt westbound on I-10. 4 armed subjects in black SUV and pickup truck in pursuit. They were operating fake DOT checkpoint at mile marker 318. Request immediate state police response. Within minutes, my CB lit up with responses from other truckers and law enforcement. Desert Freighter, this is Arizona State Police Dispatch. We're sending units to your location. What's your current mile marker? Passing mile marker 325, maintaining highway speed. Suspects about half a mile behind me in a black Tahoe. Copy, Desert Freighter. We have 3 units en route, ETA 5 minutes. Continue westbound and maintain radio contact. Those 5 minutes felt like an hour. The SUV had closed the gap and was trying to force me off the road, pulling alongside my trailer and swerving toward me. I could hear my cargo shifting as I fought to keep the truck stable, and I knew if they forced me into the median at highway speed, the resulting crash would likely kill me. Finally, I saw the most beautiful sight in the world. Red and blue flashing lights in my side mirror, coming up fast behind the chase vehicles. The SUV and pickup immediately broke off their pursuit and tried to flee, but more police units were coming from ahead, boxing them in. I pulled over at the next exit, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Within an hour, I was giving statements to state police, FBI agents, and DOT investigators. The fake checkpoint operation was more sophisticated than it had initially appeared. They'd stolen actual DOT equipment, forged credentials, and had been robbing truckers for months. The investigation revealed that the crew had stolen over $2 million worth of cargo from trucks they'd stopped at fake checkpoints across 3 states. They specifically targeted pharmaceutical shipments, electronics, and other high-value freight that could be easily resold. Some drivers who'd been robbed were found tied up in the desert, dehydrated and traumatized but alive. Others were never found. The leader of the operation turned out to be a former DOT officer who'd been fired for corruption. He knew the procedures well enough to fool most drivers, at least initially. His crew included ex-cons with robbery convictions and one guy who was wanted for armed robbery in 2 other states. All 4 men were eventually convicted on federal charges, including impersonating federal officers, armed robbery, and conspiracy. The ringleader got 25 years. The others got between 10 and 15 years each. But the experience changed how I approach every weigh station and inspection. Now, I verify the location against my GPS and company database before pulling over. I check for proper signage, permanent structures, and official vehicle markings. If anything seems off, I call my dispatcher or state police before stopping. I also learned that fake law enforcement is more common than most people realize. Criminals know that truckers are trained to comply with authority figures, and they exploit that training to commit robberies. The key is knowing the difference between legitimate enforcement and someone trying to exploit your compliance. These days, I tell every new driver I meet, when in doubt, verify. Real law enforcement officers understand the need for drivers to confirm their identity, especially in remote locations. Anyone who gets angry or aggressive when asked for proper credentials is probably not who they claim to be, because sometimes the people wearing badges and claiming to protect you are the ones you need protection from. It was supposed to be a routine 10-hour break, nothing more than a chance to catch some sleep and reset my driving clock. I'd been hauling electronics from Detroit to Miami for J.B. Hunt, making good time on I-75 through Georgia when my electronic logs forced me to shut down for the night. The closest truck stop was Pine Ridge Travel Plaza, a small operation about 20 miles south of Macon that most drivers avoided unless they absolutely had to stop. Pine Ridge wasn't your typical modern truck stop. No major chains, no fancy amenities, just a small diner, basic shower facilities, and a gravel lot that could hold maybe 30 trucks. The place had a reputation among drivers for being quiet, too quiet. Most of us preferred the busier stops where there was always activity, always other drivers around. But it was nearly midnight in November 2022, and I didn't have a choice. I pulled my 2018 Kenworth into a spot near the back of the lot, away from the few other trucks scattered around. There was a beat-up Freightliner parked by the diner, an old Peterbilt near the fuel pumps, and a white Volvo with Michigan plates sitting under the only working light pole. The rest of the lot was swallowed by shadows cast by the surrounding pine trees that gave the place its name. The temperature had dropped to about 35 degrees, cold enough to make the walk to the diner uncomfortable but not quite freezing. I grabbed my jacket and headed inside to get some coffee and maybe a sandwich before settling in for the night. The diner was typical truck stop fare, worn vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of grease and stale cigarettes that never quite aired out. Only 3 other drivers were inside, scattered across different booths, keeping to themselves. The waitress behind the counter looked tired but friendly enough. I ordered black coffee and a ham sandwich, then took a seat near the window where I could keep an eye on my truck. That's when I first noticed him. He was sitting in the corner booth, a large man, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and forearms covered in tattoos. He wore a leather jacket despite being indoors, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Every few minutes, he'd glance up from his coffee and scan the room, his gaze lingering on each driver before moving on to the next. When his eyes met mine, I felt an uncomfortable chill. There was something predatory about his stare, like he was sizing me up for something. I looked away and focused on my sandwich, but I could feel him watching me. First time at Pine Ridge, the waitress asked as she refilled my coffee. Yeah, usually stop at the Flying J up near Cordeal, I replied. This place always this quiet. She lowered her voice and leaned closer. Quieter than it used to be. We've had some issues lately. Drivers have been reporting strange things. Sounds at night, people prowling around the trucks. Management doesn't like us talking about it, but between you and me, I'd lock your doors tight tonight. I glanced back at the man in the corner booth, but he was gone. His coffee cup was still steaming, but his seat was empty. The front door was swinging shut, suggesting he'd just left. I finished my meal quickly and headed back to my truck. The lot seemed darker than when I'd arrived, like someone had turned off additional lights while I was inside. I made sure my truck was secure, checked that my trailer doors were locked, and climbed into my sleeper berth. I always traveled with a small baseball bat and kept it within arm's reach, a habit I'd developed after hearing too many scary stories from other drivers. The sleeper berth in my Kenworth was comfortable enough for a night's rest, with a decent mattress and blackout curtains. I settled in around 12:30 a.m., setting my alarm for 10:30 to give me the full 10 hours required by DOT regulations. I'd barely drifted off when something woke me. A sound, subtle but distinct. Footsteps on gravel, moving slowly around my truck. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps paused near my fuel tank, then moved toward the back of my trailer. Someone was definitely out there, walking a complete circle around my rig. I crept to the small window in my sleeper berth and peered through the curtain. In the dim light from the truck stop's security lamps, I could make out a shadowy figure moving between the parked trucks. Tall, wearing dark clothing, moving with purpose rather than the casual wandering of a restless driver. The figure stopped at the white Volvo and tried the door handles. Locked. He moved on to the next truck, repeating the process. When he reached my truck, I held my breath and remained completely motionless. He walked around my Kenworth twice, pausing at each door and window, testing handles, and even climbing up to check if my cab doors were secured. I could hear his breathing, see the fog of his breath in the cold air. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on to the next truck. I grabbed my cell phone and considered calling 911, but what would I report? Someone walking around trucks in a truck stop parking lot. That wasn't necessarily illegal, and without any actual threatening behavior, the police probably wouldn't respond quickly to such a remote location. Instead, I got on my CB radio and switched to Channel 19. Anyone else awake at Pine Ridge Travel Plaza? Got someone prowling around the lot, checking trucks. Static for a few seconds, then a voice crackled through. Pine Ridge, this is Moondog in the Blue Pete by the fuel pumps. Yeah, I saw him too. Been watching for about 20 minutes. Creepy as hell. Anyone know who it is? I asked. Another voice joined the conversation. Red Volvo here. That's the third night this week I've seen the same guy. Big dude in a leather jacket. Tried my doors earlier too. My blood ran cold. The man from the diner had been doing this for days, testing trucks looking for unlocked doors or sleeping drivers who weren't being careful about security. We should call the cops, I transmitted. Already did 2 nights ago, replied Red Volvo. They said unless someone actually gets hurt or property gets damaged, it's not a priority. Told us to keep our doors locked and avoid stopping here if possible. That's when I realized this wasn't just some random weirdo. This was someone who knew the system, knew that his behavior fell into a gray area where law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't intervene until it was too late. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for sounds and checking my mirrors every few minutes. Around 4 a.m., I heard an engine start and watched headlights sweep across the lot as someone drove away, but I couldn't tell if it was our prowler or just another driver heading back to the road. When daylight came, I inspected my truck and found fresh scratches around my door handles and mud smeared on my windows where someone had tried to peer inside. The other drivers I talked to found similar evidence on their rigs. The waitress confirmed what I'd started to suspect. That man in the leather jacket, she said quietly. He's not a driver. Never seen him with a truck. He shows up here a few nights a week, hangs around until the lot gets quiet, then disappears before dawn. Has anyone reported him to management? She laughed bitterly. Management is one guy who lives 50 miles away and only cares if the cash register works. Far as he's concerned, as long as nobody gets killed in the parking lot, it's not his problem. I gathered information from the other drivers before leaving that morning. We compared notes, and a disturbing pattern emerged. The prowler had been targeting lone drivers, specifically those parked in isolated areas of the lot. He'd test doors and windows, apparently looking for someone who was either careless about security or sound enough asleep that he could gain entry without waking them. What terrified me most was realizing how close I'd come to becoming his victim. If I hadn't been a light sleeper, if I hadn't locked my doors, if I'd parked in one of the darker corners of the lot, things could have ended very differently. I reported everything to the Georgia State Police when I reached my delivery point in Miami, providing descriptions, license plate numbers I'd managed to collect, and a detailed account of the prowler's behavior. The trooper I spoke with told me they'd been receiving similar reports from truck stops across North Georgia and South Alabama. "We think he's targeting drivers specifically," the trooper explained. "Someone who understands trucker schedules, knows when drivers are most vulnerable, and uses remote truck stops where response times are slow." 3 weeks later, I got a call from that same trooper. They'd arrested a man named Robert Hayes at a truck stop near Valdosta. Hayes had been hiding in an unlocked sleeper berth when the driver returned from the diner. When confronted, Hayes attacked the driver with a knife before being subdued by other truckers who heard the commotion. The investigation revealed that Hayes had been stalking truck stops for over 2 years, looking for opportunities to rob, assault, or worse. He'd been linked to at least 6 attacks on drivers and was suspected in several cases where drivers had simply vanished from remote truck stops, their trucks found abandoned days later. Hayes wasn't a trucker himself, but he'd spent years studying trucker behavior, learning their schedules, understanding their vulnerabilities. He specifically targeted solo drivers at isolated stops, knowing they'd be tired, alone, and far from immediate help. The case changed how I approach overnight stops. I never park in remote areas anymore, always choose well-lit spots near other trucks, and I've installed additional locks on my cab doors. I also started carrying a 2-way radio tuned to local law enforcement frequencies, so I can call for help even if my cell phone doesn't have service. Most importantly, I learned that predators often hide in plain sight at places where we feel safest. The man in the diner who seemed like just another customer was actually hunting us, using our own habits and routines against us. Because the scariest thing about Robert Hayes wasn't his violence, it was his patience. He'd spent years learning exactly how to hunt truck drivers, and if not for a few alert drivers and a little bit of luck, he might have kept hunting indefinitely. It was supposed to be a straightforward run from Denver to Portland, hauling a load of high-end electronics worth about $300,000. I'd been driving for Maverick Transportation for 6 years, and this particular route along Interstate 80 West to Interstate 84 was one I'd run dozens of times. The cargo was time-sensitive, gaming consoles and smartphones destined for retail stores that needed them in stock before a major product launch. My delivery window was tight, but doable if I maintained my schedule and avoided any major delays. The trouble started around 2 p.m. on a Tuesday in late September 2023, somewhere between Cheyenne and Laramie, Wyoming. I was making excellent time, my 2021 Freightliner Cascadia humming along at a steady 65 miles per hour through the rolling hills and open plains. The weather was perfect, clear skies, light traffic, and my electronic log showing I had plenty of drive time left before my mandatory break. That's when my GPS suddenly announced an incident ahead. Accident reported on I-80 westbound, the synthetic voice declared. Rerouting to alternate route. Follow highlighted path. I glanced at the screen and saw my route changing from the familiar blue line of the interstate to a series of smaller roads heading north. The estimated delay was showing as 45 minutes additional, which wasn't ideal but wasn't catastrophic either. Accidents happen, and I'd been rerouted before. But something about this felt different. For one thing, I hadn't seen any signs of an accident. No emergency vehicles racing past, no backed up traffic, no CB chatter from other drivers about delays ahead. I keyed my radio and tried channel 19. Breaker 19, this is Rocky Mountain Hauler westbound on I-80 near mile marker 315. Anyone got ears on an accident up ahead? Static filled the radio for several seconds. Then a voice crackled through. Rocky Mountain, this is Desert Fox eastbound. Just passed through that area about an hour ago. Roads were clear, no problems reported. I frowned and checked my GPS again. The reroute was taking me north on State Route 130, then west on a series of county roads I'd never heard of. According to the map, these roads would eventually connect back to I-80 about 60 miles ahead, but they looked like they wound through some pretty remote country. I tried calling my dispatcher to verify the reroute, but my cell phone showed no signal. That wasn't unusual in this part of Wyoming. Cell towers were sparse, and dead zones were common. Still, something nagged at me about the whole situation. The exit for Route 130 was coming up fast. I had to make a decision: trust the GPS and take the detour, or ignore it and continue on Interstate 80 to see if there really was an accident ahead. The GPS was becoming more insistent, repeating, "Turn right in 500 feet," with increasing urgency. Against my better judgment, I took the exit. Route 130 started out fine, a decent 2-lane highway heading north through ranch country. But after about 20 miles, the GPS directed me onto a smaller county road, then onto an even smaller road that was barely wide enough for my truck. The asphalt gave way to gravel, and the landscape became increasingly isolated. Rolling hills covered in sagebrush stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional weathered fence line or abandoned building. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. That's when I started getting really worried. I pulled over at what looked like an old gas station, just a concrete pad and some rusted pumps surrounded by weeds, and tried to get my bearings. My GPS was still showing the route, but the estimated arrival time had increased to 2 hours additional. I was now looking at a significant delay that would put my delivery behind schedule. I tried my CB radio again, switching through all the channels, but got nothing but static. My cell phone still showed no signal. For the first time in years of trucking, I felt truly isolated. As I sat there trying to figure out my options, I noticed something in my mirrors. Dust was rising in the distance behind me, suggesting an approaching vehicle. My first thought was relief. Maybe another driver who could help me figure out where I was. But as the vehicle got closer, I could see it wasn't a truck. It was a dark pickup with tinted windows, and it was moving fast on the gravel road, kicking up a large dust cloud. The pickup slowed as it approached my truck, then pulled alongside my cab. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He didn't look like a local rancher or someone who belonged in this remote area. "You lost?" he called out through his window. "GPS rerouted me off the interstate," I replied. "Said there was an accident." He shook his head. "No accidents out that way. You're about 50 miles from anything that resembles civilization." He gestured toward the west. "This road doesn't go where you think it goes." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "Road's been washed out about 10 miles ahead. Spring flooding took out the bridge. GPS companies haven't updated their maps yet." He paused, studying my truck and trailer. "What you hauling?" Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. Experienced truckers know that's not a question legitimate locals ask. It's too specific, too focused on cargo. And his story about the washed-out bridge didn't make sense. If the road was impassable, why hadn't my GPS warned me about that? "Just general freight," I said vaguely. "How do I get back to the interstate?" "You'll have to turn around," he said. "But that's going to be tough in a big rig like that. Road's pretty narrow up ahead." As if on cue, 2 more vehicles appeared in my mirrors, another pickup and what looked like an old sedan. They pulled up behind my trailer, effectively boxing me in. "Problem is," the man continued, "you're going to need help backing out of here. These roads can be tricky for someone who doesn't know them." I could see where this was heading. The helpful local routine was a classic setup for robbery or worse. They'd isolated me in a remote area, cut off my communications, and now they were offering help that would probably involve getting me out of my truck. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I think I can manage." His friendly demeanor shifted slightly. "I really think you're going to need assistance. Why don't you step out and we can take a look at your options?" That's when I made my move. Instead of responding, I reached for my air horn and laid on it with 3 long blasts, the universal trucker distress signal. If any legitimate drivers were within miles, they'd know someone was in trouble. The man's expression changed completely. "Turn that off." But I kept my hand on the horn, sending out blast after blast while simultaneously reaching for my CB radio. Even if I couldn't reach other drivers, the radio had an emergency beacon that would broadcast my location to law enforcement agencies monitoring trucker frequencies. The pickup driver said something I couldn't hear over the horn to the occupants of the other vehicles. Car doors started opening, and I could see at least 4 men getting out. One of them was carrying what looked like a crowbar. I didn't wait to see what they had planned. I released the air horn, shifted into first gear, and started moving forward slowly. The gravel road was narrow, but I figured I could use my size and weight advantage to push through whatever obstacle they tried to put in front of me. The man in the pickup scrambled back into his vehicle and tried to block my path, but I kept moving. The sound of gravel against metal filled the air as my front bumper made contact with his truck. He realized quickly that his vehicle was no match for 80,000 pounds of truck and trailer, and he backed off. In my mirrors, I could see the other men running back to their vehicles, apparently abandoning whatever plan they'd had. I kept moving forward, following the gravel road as it wound through the hills, my heart pounding and my hands gripping the steering wheel. About 10 miles later, I reached a paved road with actual road signs. According to the signs, I was about 30 miles north of I-80 in an area I'd never heard of. More importantly, my cell phone suddenly showed 3 bars of signal. I immediately called 911 and reported the incident, providing as much detail as I could about the location and the vehicles involved. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit to investigate, but warned me that response times in that area could be over an hour due to the remote location. I also called my dispatcher and explained what had happened. He confirmed that there had been no accidents reported on Interstate 80 and no official detours. He also ran a check on my GPS unit and discovered that someone had hacked into the system and installed false routing data. The Wyoming State Police investigation revealed that I'd been targeted by a sophisticated cargo theft ring that specialized in high-value electronics shipments. They used GPS hacking to divert trucks into remote areas where they could be robbed without witnesses. The fake accident reports and route diversions were designed to make drivers think they were following legitimate detours. The investigation also uncovered that this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the previous 6 months, at least 12 other drivers had been diverted off major highways in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. Most had been robbed, and 2 drivers had been seriously injured when they tried to resist. The ringleader turned out to be a former truck driver who knew the industry inside and out. He understood driver psychology, knew how GPS systems worked, and had connections with people who could hack into navigation databases. His crew would monitor trucking company dispatch communications, identify high-value loads, and then divert those specific trucks into ambush zones. What made the scheme particularly effective was that it exploited drivers' trust in technology. Most of us had become so dependent on GPS navigation that we rarely questioned route changes, especially when they were presented as safety measures to avoid accidents or construction. The whole experience changed how I approach navigation and route planning. I now carry backup GPS units from different manufacturers, paper maps of my major routes, and I always verify any significant route changes with my dispatcher before following them. I also learned to trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Most importantly, I learned that criminals are constantly adapting to new technologies and finding ways to exploit them. The same GPS systems that make trucking more efficient also create new vulnerabilities that can be used against us. These days, when my GPS tries to send me down an unfamiliar road because of a reported incident. I take the time to verify that the incident is real and the detour is legitimate, because sometimes the road that promises to keep you safe is actually leading you straight into danger. I'd been an owner-operator for 13 years, and my 2019 Kenworth W900 with its extended sleeper berth had become more than just a truck. It was my home away from home. Over the years, I'd developed a routine for overnight stops that had kept me safe through thousands of nights parked at truck stops across the country. Always choose well-lit spots, always lock the doors, always keep a tire iron within arm's reach. But in November 2022, all those precautions weren't enough to protect me from what happened at Miller's Truck Plaza outside Bakersfield, California. I was hauling a load of frozen foods from a processing plant in Salinas to a distribution center in Phoenix, running behind schedule because of an unexpected delay at the shipper. My electronic logs showed I had about 3 hours left on my drive clock when I reached Bakersfield, but I was exhausted. I'd been pushing hard for 2 days, trying to make up time, and I knew I needed to shut down for my mandatory 10-hour break before I became a danger to myself and other drivers. Miller's Truck Plaza was one of those independent stops that had been serving truckers for decades. Not as fancy as the big chain operations, but clean, safe, and reasonably priced. I'd stopped there dozens of times over the years without incident. The fuel was usually a few cents cheaper than the major brands, and Dolores, the night clerk, always had fresh coffee and a friendly word for regular customers like me. I pulled into the lot around 9 p.m., backing my rig into a spot near the main building where the lighting was good and there was steady foot traffic from other drivers. The lot was about half full, maybe 20 trucks scattered across the asphalt, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber in the darkness. After fueling up and checking my trailer temperature, I headed inside to grab some dinner and use the shower facilities. The diner was typical truck stop fare: formica tables, vinyl booths, and the smell of grease and coffee that never quite faded. I ordered a cheeseburger and fries, chatted briefly with a couple of other drivers about road conditions and fuel prices, then returned to my truck around 10:30. My sleeper berth was set up exactly the way I liked it: a comfortable mattress, blackout curtains, and all my personal items within easy reach. I had a small TV mounted on the wall, a mini fridge stocked with drinks, and enough space to stretch out and relax. It was cramped compared to a hotel room, but it was mine, and I'd always felt secure there. I set my alarm for 8:30 a.m., giving me exactly 10 hours off duty as required by federal regulations. The familiar sounds of the truck stop surrounded me: diesel engines idling, the hiss of air brakes, muffled conversations from other drivers, and the occasional rumble of a truck departing for an early morning run. These sounds had become my lullaby over the years, and I usually fell asleep within minutes of lying down, but that night was different. I'd been asleep for maybe 3 hours when something woke me. At first, I couldn't identify what it was, just a vague sense that something had changed. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it again. A soft metallic sound, like someone gently testing a door handle. My truck had 2 main entry points: the driver's side door that led into the cab, and a separate door that opened directly into the sleeper compartment. Both doors had deadbolt locks that I always engaged before settling in for the night, but someone was definitely manipulating one of those handles. I reached for the tire iron I kept beside my bed, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The sound came again, more deliberate this time. Someone was working on the sleeper berth door, trying to gain entry while they thought I was asleep. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept to the small window near the head of my bunk and peered through the curtains. In the dim light from the truck stop's security lamps, I could see a figure crouched near my sleeper door, medium height, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap, working methodically on the lock with what looked like a set of lockpicks. My blood went ice cold. This wasn't a random vandal or someone looking for loose change. This was someone with specialized tools and the knowledge to use them. Someone who had targeted my truck specifically. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to Channel 9, the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday. This is KW 900 at Miller's Truck Plaza in Bakersfield. Someone attempting to break into my sleeper berth. Request immediate assistance. The radio crackled with static, then silence. I tried again on Channel 19, hoping to reach other drivers in the area. Breaker 19, this is KW 900 at Miller's. Got a prowler trying to break into my truck. Anyone else awake out there? A voice crackled back almost immediately. KW 900, this is Desert Rat in the Blue Pete about 6 spots over. I see a guy near your truck. You want me to come over? Affirmative, Desert Rat. But be careful. This guy came prepared. I could hear footsteps on gravel, growing louder as Desert Rat approached my location. The intruder must have heard them too, because suddenly the lock-picking sound stopped. Through my window, I saw the figure stand up and look around, then quickly disappear into the shadows between the parked trucks. A few minutes later, I heard Desert Rat's voice through my CB, KW 900. Whoever it was took off running when he saw me coming. But you need to see this. I unlocked my door and climbed out of the sleeper berth. Desert Rat was standing near my truck with a flashlight, illuminating scratches and gouges around my door lock. The intruder had come close to defeating the deadbolt. Probably just a few more minutes, and he would have been inside. This ain't his first rodeo, Desert Rat observed, examining the lock damage. These marks are too clean, too professional. Whoever did this knows what he's doing. We walked around my entire truck, checking for other signs of tampering. Near the rear of my trailer, Desert Rat's flashlight caught something that made both of us freeze. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Attached to the underside of my trailer, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was a small electronic device about the size of a pack of cigarettes. It was held in place with heavy-duty magnets and appeared to have a small antenna. "GPS tracker," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's been following my movements." Desert Rat helped me remove the device while I called the local police. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit, but warned that response time might be 30 to 40 minutes due to their location outside the city limits. While we waited for law enforcement, I started thinking about the implications of what we'd discovered. Someone had been tracking my truck, learning my routes and habits, waiting for the right opportunity to break in. But why? My cargo was valuable, but not extraordinarily so. Frozen foods worth maybe $40,000. Hardly enough to justify the sophisticated operation we'd uncovered. The answer came when the police arrived, and I had a chance to examine the tracking device more closely. It wasn't just a simple GPS unit. It was a sophisticated piece of equipment that could monitor not just location, but also engine status, trailer door sensors, and even driving patterns. Someone was gathering detailed intelligence about my operations. Officer Martinez, the investigating deputy, told me this wasn't an isolated incident. "We've had reports from truck stops all along this corridor," he explained. "Someone's been targeting owner-operators, placing tracking devices, learning their routines. 3 other drivers have reported break-in attempts in the past month." "Any idea who's behind it?" "We're working with the FBI on this one. They think it's organized, possibly a crew that specializes in cargo theft. They track drivers for weeks or months, learning when and where they're most vulnerable, then strike when the conditions are right." The investigation that followed revealed a complex criminal operation that had been targeting independent truckers across California, Nevada, and Arizona. The crew would plant tracking devices on trucks carrying high-value cargo, monitor the drivers' patterns for several weeks, then plan coordinated attacks when the trucks were most isolated. They had inside information from dispatch services, fuel card databases, and even truck stop loyalty programs. They knew what drivers were hauling, where they were going, and when they'd be stopping for their mandatory rest breaks. What made the operation particularly dangerous was their willingness to enter occupied sleeper berths. Most cargo thieves prefer to steal unattended trailers or hijack trucks on remote highways. But this crew was prepared to assault drivers in their sleep, if necessary. The tracking device found on my truck had been there for 3 weeks, recording my every movement. They knew I regularly stopped at Miller's Truck Plaza, that I preferred the spots near the main building, and that I typically slept heavily for the first few hours after lying down. If Desert Rat hadn't been awake and alert, I might have woken up to find an intruder standing over my bed. Or worse, I might not have woken up at all. The FBI eventually arrested 6 members of the crew, including the lock-picking specialist, who had tried to enter my sleeper berth. They found dozens of tracking devices, detailed surveillance records on more than 50 drivers, and evidence linking them to at least 12 successful cargo thefts totaling over $2 million. But the psychological damage was already done. The sleeper berth that had been my sanctuary for 13 years now felt like a trap. Every sound at night made me jump. Every movement in the truck stop lot made me suspicious. I installed additional locks, motion sensors, and even a small security camera that I could monitor from my phone. More importantly, I changed my entire approach to overnight stops. No more predictable patterns. No more favorite truck stops. No more parking in the same types of spots. I started varying my routes, my timing, and my stopping points. I joined a network of drivers who shared security information and watched out for each other. The experience taught me that the modern trucking industry faces threats that didn't exist even a decade ago. Technology that makes our jobs easier, GPS tracking, electronic logs, digital payment systems, also creates vulnerabilities that criminals can exploit. We're more connected than ever, but that connectivity comes with risks that many drivers don't fully understand. These days, I perform a thorough security check every time I park for the night. I sweep my truck for tracking devices, check for signs of tampering, and stay in regular contact with other drivers in the area. I've also invested in counter-surveillance equipment and taken courses on personal security. Because the truth is, when you're sleeping in a truck stop parking lot, you're not just resting, you're potentially making yourself a target. And the criminals who prey on truckers are becoming more sophisticated, more organized, and more dangerous every year. The road may call itself the last frontier of American freedom, but that freedom comes with a price. And sometimes, the cost of letting your guard down for even one night can be everything you've worked for. Or everything you are. I'd been driving for Prime Inc. for about 9 years, and fuel stops were as routine as checking my mirrors or adjusting my seat. You develop habits over nearly a decade on the road. Favorite truck stops, preferred fuel islands, trusted payment methods. But in August 2023, those very habits nearly destroyed my financial life and taught me that even the most mundane aspects of trucking can harbor sophisticated criminal operations. The day started normally enough. I was running a high-value electronics load from Austin to Denver, pushing hard to make an early delivery appointment that would get me home for my daughter's birthday. I'd been running this route regularly for Prime, and I knew every good fuel stop along the way. My fuel card had a credit limit of $3,000, which was standard for company drivers hauling valuable freight. Around 1 p.m., my fuel gauge was showing about a quarter tank, and I started looking for a place to top off. The next good stop was Big Rig Travel Center, outside Amarillo, a place I'd fueled at dozens of times over the years. It was a large, well-established truck stop with competitive fuel prices, clean facilities, and what I thought was good security. I pulled my 2020 Freightliner Cascadia onto the fuel island, backing up to pump number 7 in the middle lane. The spot gave me good visibility of the surrounding area and easy access back to the highway. Standard procedure for any experienced driver. The fuel island was busy, but not crowded. Maybe 8 trucks fueling at various pumps, with the usual mix of company drivers and owner-operators. I shut down my engine, grabbed my fuel card and trip paperwork, and climbed down from the cab. The card reader on pump 7 looked normal at first glance. Same design as thousands of other readers I'd used over the years, with the familiar slot for swiping and a digital display showing fuel prices. I inserted my Prime fuel card and entered my PIN, expecting the usual sequence of prompts. Instead, the screen flickered and displayed an error message. Card read error. Please try again. I pulled the card out, checked it for scratches or damage, and tried again. Same error message. On the third attempt, the screen went completely blank, then displayed system offline, see attendant. That should have been my first warning sign, but fuel pumps malfunction all the time. Equipment breaks down, card readers get dirty or damaged, and see attendant messages are common enough that most drivers don't think twice about them. I looked around for an attendant and spotted a young guy in his early 20s, wearing a big rig travel center uniform shirt. He was walking between pumps, helping other drivers with various issues. Nothing unusual about that. Most major truck stops have roving attendants during busy periods. Having trouble with the pump? He asked as he approached, his voice friendly and professional. Card reader's not working, I replied, holding up my fuel card. Keeps giving me error messages. He nodded knowingly. Yeah, we've been having issues with that pump all morning. Let me take your card and run it manually at the booth. Happens all the time. I hesitated for a moment. Company policy was pretty clear about not letting our fuel cards out of our sight, but this seemed like a routine technical problem. The attendant looked legitimate, wore the right uniform, and seemed to know what he was talking about. How long will it take? I asked. Just a couple minutes. I'll get you set up and you can start fueling. I handed over my card and he walked toward the attendant booth, a small glass structure in the center of the fuel island where employees could monitor multiple pumps and handle transactions. The booth was maybe 50 yards away, well within sight, so I didn't feel like I was letting the card out of my supervision. While I waited, I started my pre-fueling inspection routine, checking my tire pressure and looking for any obvious problems with my rig. That's when I noticed something that should have set off every alarm bell in my head. At pump number 4, about 3 spaces over, another driver was having what appeared to be the exact same problem. His card reader was displaying error messages, and the same attendant was walking over to help him. Same routine, same explanation, same offer to run the card manually at the booth. But what caught my attention was the driver's reaction. He looked nervous, almost agitated, as he handed over his card. When the attendant walked away, the driver pulled out his cell phone and started making what looked like an urgent call. A few minutes later, when my attendant returned with my card, he was smiling a little too broadly. All set, he said, handing me the card and a fuel receipt. Should work fine now. I swiped the card again, and this time the pump sprang to life immediately. The authorization went through, the fuel started flowing, and everything seemed normal. I filled my tank with 150 gallons of diesel, signed the receipt, and headed inside the truck stop to grab some coffee and use the restroom. That's when my phone started buzzing with notifications. The first alert came from my bank's fraud detection system. Unusual account activity detected. Please verify recent transactions. Then another alert, and another. Within 5 minutes, I had 6 different fraud alerts on my phone, all showing fuel purchases made with my card number at locations I'd never been to. My blood went cold as I read through the alerts. Someone was using my fuel card information to make purchases in real time, while I was standing in the truck stop where I'd just legitimately used that same card. The fraudulent transactions were showing up at truck stops in New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Kansas, all locations I couldn't possibly have reached. I immediately called the fraud hotline on the back of my card. The customer service representative confirmed my worst fears. "Sir, your card number has been compromised. We're showing 17 unauthorized transactions totaling $2,847 in the past 30 minutes. We're freezing your account immediately." "How is that possible?" "I'm looking at my physical card right now. Your card information has been cloned or skimmed. Someone has created duplicate cards using your account data. You'll need to file a police report and contact your company's fleet manager immediately." I hung up and called my dispatcher, my hands shaking with anger and anxiety. Fleet manager Rodriguez had heard this story before. "Big Rig Travel Center in Amarillo," he asked when I told him where I'd fueled. "Yeah, how did you know?" "Because you're the fourth prime driver this month to get skimmed at that location. We've been working with law enforcement, but these guys are sophisticated. They've got inside help." Rodriguez explained that the skimming operation at Big Rig wasn't just opportunistic crime. It was an organized effort involving employees, sophisticated equipment, and connections to international fraud networks. The fake attendant who'd offered to help me wasn't an employee at all, but someone who'd infiltrated the truck stop specifically to steal card data from drivers. "The real employees don't know who's legitimate and who isn't," Rodriguez said. "These guys have fake uniforms, fake ID badges, and they know enough about truck stop operations to blend in perfectly." As the investigation unfolded over the following weeks, I learned just how extensive the operation was. The skimming ring had placed devices inside legitimate card readers that captured magnetic strip data and PIN numbers. They'd also recruited corrupt employees at truck stops across Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma to install the devices and provide access to fuel islands during busy periods. The fake attendant, who'd taken my card, had used a portable card reader to capture all my account information in the few minutes he was away from my site. Within seconds of scanning my card, that data was transmitted to accomplices who were already stationed at other truck stops hundreds of miles away, ready to create cloned cards and start making purchases. But the financial theft was just the beginning of my problems. Because the fraudulent charges were made on my company fuel card, Prime's accounting department initially held me responsible for the losses. Even though I'd reported the fraud immediately, I had to prove that I hadn't somehow facilitated the theft or violated company security policies. The internal investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, I was restricted to regional runs where I could fuel at company-owned facilities, which severely limited my earning potential. Prime also suspended my fuel card privileges, forcing me to pay for fuel out of pocket and submit receipts for reimbursement, a process that could take weeks and put serious strain on my personal finances. The psychological impact was almost worse than the financial damage. Every fuel stop became a source of anxiety. I started examining every card reader with a magnifying glass, looking for signs of tampering. I questioned every attendant who offered help, wondering if they were legitimate employees or criminals in disguise. I learned to inspect card readers for loose parts, unusual attachments, or anything that looked different from standard equipment. I started using only fuel stops with visible security cameras in well-lit pump areas. Most importantly, I never let my fuel card out of my sight again, regardless of how minor the problem seemed. The FBI eventually arrested 12 people connected to the skimming operation, including the fake attendant who'd stolen my card data. The investigation revealed that the ring had stolen over $4.2 million from truck drivers across 6 states, with individual victims losing anywhere from a few hundred to several $1,000s. The leader of the operation turned out to be a former truck stop manager who understood the industry well enough to exploit its vulnerabilities. He'd recruited accomplices from his network of contacts in the trucking and fuel industry, including current and former truck stop employees who provided inside access to fuel island systems. What made the operation particularly effective was their understanding of trucker behavior and psychology. They knew that drivers are often in a hurry, focused on maintaining their schedules, and accustomed to minor equipment problems at fuel stops. They exploited that routine acceptance of inconvenience to create opportunities for theft. 6 months later, I finally got full reimbursement for the fraudulent charges, but the experience changed how I approach every aspect of financial security on the road. I now carry multiple fuel cards from different accounts, use cash when possible, and maintained detailed records of every transaction. More importantly, I learned that criminals are constantly evolving their methods to target truckers specifically. They study our habits, our schedules, and our vulnerabilities, then design sophisticated operations to exploit them. The friendly attendant offering to help with a malfunctioning card reader might genuinely want to assist you, or might be part of a multi-million-dollar fraud ring. Because in trucking, even the most routine tasks can harbor hidden dangers. And sometimes the person who seems most eager to help you is actually helping themselves to your financial future. I'd been an independent owner-operator for 7 years, and convoy runs weren't something I normally did. I preferred the freedom of solo hauling, setting my own pace, choosing my own routes. But in October 2023, when Transglobal Logistics offered me a premium rate to haul pharmaceutical supplies from Memphis to Baltimore as part of a secure convoy, the money was too good to pass up. They were paying 40% above standard rates, and with winter coming, I needed every dollar I could get. The briefing at the Transglobal facility was more extensive than anything I'd experienced for a regular freight haul. The convoy coordinator, a former military logistics officer named Rodriguez, explained that we'd be transporting high-value medical supplies through several areas that had seen increased cargo theft activity. Running in convoy formation would provide mutual protection and allow for coordinated response if we encountered trouble. Pharmaceutical loads are prime targets, Rodriguez explained to the 8 drivers assembled in the conference room. Street value on some of these medications runs into the millions. That's why Transglobal is implementing enhanced security protocols for this route. Each driver was assigned a convoy position and call sign. I was designated Convoy 7, driving 5th position in the formation. The lead truck would be driven by Rodriguez himself, followed by 2 company drivers I'd never met, then a husband and wife team from Oklahoma, then me, then 3 more drivers bringing up the rear. We were given detailed route maps, communication frequencies, and specific instructions about maintaining formation. No unauthorized stops, no breaking convoy without permission, and continuous CB communication on a dedicated channel. If anyone had mechanical problems or emergencies, the entire convoy would stop to provide assistance. The cargo loading process was more secretive than usual. Instead of watching my trailer get loaded like I normally would, drivers were required to wait in the dispatch office while freight handlers loaded and sealed our trailers. We received bills of lading that listed only medical supplies, with weights and piece counts, but no specific details about what we were hauling. Security through obscurity, Rodriguez explained. The less you know about specific cargo details, the less information you can accidentally reveal if someone asks the wrong questions. We departed Memphis at 6 a.m. sharp, forming up on Interstate 40 eastbound in perfect convoy formation. Rodriguez set the pace at a steady 62 miles per hour, and we maintained precise spacing between trucks. Every 15 minutes, each driver checked in by radio with position number and status. It felt professional, military-like, and reassuringly secure. For the first day, everything went exactly as planned. We moved through Tennessee and into Virginia like a well-oiled machine, stopping only for fuel at predetermined locations, where Transglobal had prearranged. Security Rodriguez handled all communication with fuel attendants and truck stop personnel, while the rest of us remained with our vehicles. But on the second day, things started feeling different. It began with Convoy 4, the husband and wife team who'd been chatty and friendly during our initial briefing. Suddenly, they stopped participating in the regular radio check-ins. When Rodriguez called their position, he got either silence or brief, monosyllabic responses. Convoy 4, radio check, Rodriguez would call. 4 here, came the curt reply, but it sounded different. The voice was male, but it didn't sound like the friendly guy I'd met at the briefing. It was flat, emotionless, professional, in a way that felt wrong. I keyed my CB and tried to raise them on a side channel. Convoy 4, this is 7. You folks doing all right back there? No response. Even stranger, their driving pattern had changed. During the first day, they'd maintained perfect spacing and smooth lane changes like experienced team drivers. Now they were varying their following distance, occasionally drifting toward the shoulder, and their lane changes were abrupt and poorly timed. By the time we stopped for our mandatory rest break at a truck stop outside Beckley, West Virginia, I was getting seriously concerned. I walked over to Convoy 4's truck during the break, planning to check on them personally. The truck was a newer Volvo VNL, but something about it looked different than it had the day before. The license plate was the same. The company logos were in the right places, but there were subtle differences. Fresh mud on the bumper that hadn't been there before, different CB antennas, a crack in the windshield that I was sure hadn't existed during our initial formation. When I knocked on the sleeper berth door, a man I'd never seen before answered. He was about the right age and billed as the driver from the briefing, but his face was wrong. Different bone structure, different eyes, definitely not the same person. "You're not Tom," I said, referring to the driver who'd introduced himself in Memphis. "Sure I am," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired, you know. Long haul takes it out of you." But I knew it wasn't him, and his wife was nowhere to be seen. I walked back to my truck with my mind racing. Either the original Convoy 4 had been replaced by imposters, or I was losing my mind from road fatigue. Neither option felt good. I decided to test my theory during the next radio check. When Rodriguez called for position reports, I listened carefully to each response. Convoy 1 through 3 sounded normal. Convoy 4 gave the same flat, emotionless response as before. But when I compared it to my memory of Tom's voice from the briefing, there was no question. It was a different person. We were back on the road for maybe an hour when my CB crackled with an unexpected transmission. "All units, this is Convoy 1. We're being directed to an inspection checkpoint about 10 miles ahead. Mandatory commercial vehicle inspection. Form up in single file and be prepared to stop." This wasn't part of our planned route. There had been no mention of inspection checkpoints in our briefing, and Rodriguez had emphasized that we would avoid any unscheduled stops that could compromise security. I keyed my radio. "Convoy 1, this is 7. Can you verify this checkpoint with dispatch? This wasn't in our route plan." "-7. Orders are coming from higher up the chain, mandatory compliance." But something in Rodriguez's voice was wrong too. It was him. I was sure of that, but he sounded stressed, like he was reading from a script or speaking under duress. The inspection checkpoint turned out to be a temporary setup in a rest area off Interstate 64. Orange cones, portable signs, and several men in what looked like DOT enforcement uniforms. But as we lined up for inspection, I noticed details that set off every alarm bell in my head. The enforcement officers were using hand signals instead of proper inspection protocols. Their vehicles were unmarked SUVs and pickups, not the standardized enforcement trucks used by real DOT officers. And their uniforms, while close, had subtle differences from authentic DOT gear. Most telling of all, they seemed far more interested in inspecting our cargo than our vehicles. Real DOT inspections focus on safety compliance: brakes, tires, lights, driver logs. These guys went straight for the trailer doors and wanted to examine our bills of lading in detail. When it was my turn for inspection, one of the fake officers asked me to open my trailer. I refused, citing company policy about sealed loads and security protocols. "Driver, you're required by federal law to comply with DOT inspections," he said, but his tone was more threatening than professional. "Then you won't mind showing me your federal enforcement credentials and explaining why this checkpoint isn't listed in the DOT inspection database," I replied, pulling out my phone to record the interaction. That's when things went sideways fast. The fake officer grabbed for my phone while signaling to his associates. I could see other inspectors moving aggressively toward the other trucks in our convoy. Rodriguez was standing near his cab with his hands raised, clearly under duress. I sprinted back to my truck and fired up the engine, not waiting to see what the fake officers had planned. As I pulled away from the rest area, I could see several of them running for their vehicles, clearly intending to pursue me. I grabbed my CB and started broadcasting on every channel I could find. Mayday, Mayday. This is independent driver hauling pharmaceuticals on I-64 eastbound. Convoy under attack by criminals posing as DOT officers at the Sandstone Rest area. Request immediate law enforcement response. The response was immediate. Within minutes, I had real state police units responding. To my location, I met them at the next exit and led them back to the rest area, where they found the fake checkpoint abandoned and the other convoy trucks gone. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated cargo theft operation that had been targeting pharmaceutical shipments for months. The criminals had infiltrated TransGlobal's dispatch system, gained access to convoy schedules and routes, and replaced legitimate drivers with their own people at various points along the route. The real Convoy 4 had been found tied up in a motel room 50 miles back. Rodriguez and the other drivers were discovered at an abandoned warehouse, unharmed but shaken. The criminals had planned to steal all 8 trailers, worth over $3 million in pharmaceutical supplies. But the most chilling part was learning how long they'd been planning the operation. They'd been monitoring TransGlobal's communications for weeks, learning convoy procedures, identifying vulnerabilities, and positioning their people at strategic points along our route. The fake checkpoint was designed to separate the convoy and isolate individual trucks for robbery. If I hadn't noticed the differences in Convoy 4 and questioned the inspection stop, the entire operation might have succeeded. 6 months later, federal prosecutors announced the arrests of 14 people connected to the scheme, including a TransGlobal employee who provided inside information about convoy schedules and cargo values. I never ran another convoy job. The experience taught me that the same security measures designed to protect valuable cargo can also be exploited by criminals sophisticated enough to infiltrate them. Sometimes, the safest way to transport high-value freight is the same way I'd been doing it for years, alone, unpredictably, and without broadcasting my intentions to anyone who might be listening. Because when criminals are organized enough to replace drivers, hack dispatch systems, and impersonate federal officers, the only person you can really trust is yourself. After 15 years of driving for other people's companies, 2023 was finally the year I became an owner-operator. I'd saved every penny I could, worked double shifts, and sacrificed weekends with my family to buy my dream rig. A 2019 Kenworth T680 with a sleeper berth, custom paint job, and every option I could afford. It wasn't just a truck, it was my independence, my future, and my family's financial security all rolled into one gleaming piece of American steel. I'd landed a lucrative contract hauling high-end automotive parts from a manufacturer in Detroit to assembly plants across the Midwest. The routes were consistent, the pay was excellent, and the cargo was valuable enough that I was earning 30% more than I'd ever made as a company driver. After years of driving other people's equipment, I finally had control over my own destiny. But within 3 weeks of starting my new operation, strange things began happening to my truck. It started with minor inconveniences that seemed like normal mechanical issues. A blown fuse here, a loose connection there, the kind of problems that every truck develops over time. But the frequency was unusual, and the timing was always inconvenient. Failures that occurred just before important deliveries or in remote areas where repairs were expensive and time-consuming. The first major incident happened on a Tuesday morning in September, about 40 miles outside of Indianapolis. I was hauling a load of precision-machined transmission components worth $180,000, and my delivery appointment was scheduled for 8 a.m. at a General Motors facility. Missing the appointment would trigger penalty clauses in my contract that could cost me thousands of dollars. At 6:30 a.m., with plenty of time to make my delivery, my engine temperature suddenly spiked. The coolant gauge climbed rapidly from normal operating temperature to the red zone in less than 5 minutes. I pulled over immediately, knowing that running a diesel engine hot could cause catastrophic damage worth more than my truck was worth. I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. The lower radiator hose had burst, dumping coolant all over the highway. But as I examined the hose more closely, something didn't look right. Instead of the typical split or wear pattern you'd expect from a failing hose, this looked like it had been cut. A clean slice that went almost halfway through the rubber, leaving just enough material to hold pressure until the truck was under load. I called for roadside assistance, but the earliest they could reach me was 10 a.m. By the time they arrived, made repairs, and I reached the GM facility, I was 4 hours late. The penalty for missing my delivery window was $2,400, more than I'd make on the entire load. I reported the incident to my insurance company, but without proof of sabotage, they classified it as a normal mechanical failure. The claim was denied, and I was left holding the entire cost. A week later, it happened. Again, I was northbound on Interstate 65 through Kentucky, hauling a load of brake components to a Ford plant in Louisville. The truck was running perfectly when I stopped for fuel at a Flying J truck stop around midnight. I topped off my tanks, grabbed some coffee, and used the facilities. Total time away from my truck, maybe 20 minutes. 50 miles later, my air pressure warning alarm started sounding. The brake system was losing air pressure rapidly, which meant I'd lose my brakes entirely within minutes. I managed to coast into a way station and discovered that someone had cut my main airline. Not completely severed, but damaged enough that it would fail under pressure. This time, I took photos of everything before calling for help. The cut in the airline was too clean, too precise to be accidental damage. Someone had crawled under my truck while I was in the truck stop and deliberately sabotaged my braking system. The implications were terrifying. If that airline had failed on a mountain grade or in heavy traffic, I could have killed myself and multiple other drivers. This wasn't just about money anymore. Someone was trying to cause an accident. I filed a police report, but the investigating officer seemed skeptical. Could have been road debris, he said, examining my photos. Happens all the time. These trucks pick up all kinds of junk on the highway. But I knew better. Road debris doesn't make surgical cuts in airlines. Someone with knowledge of truck systems and access to cutting tools had deliberately sabotaged my brakes. The third incident convinced me that I was being systematically targeted. I was westbound on Interstate 70 through Missouri, hauling a load of electronic control modules to a Chrysler plant in Illinois. The truck had been running flawlessly for 400 miles when suddenly, without warning, my transmission started slipping. The engine would rev, but power wasn't reaching the wheels. I managed to limp into a truck stop, but my transmission was effectively destroyed. The mechanic who examined my truck was a 30-year veteran who'd seen every type of transmission failure imaginable. After 2 hours of diagnosis, he pulled me aside with a grim expression. "Somebody's been messing with your truck," he said quietly. "The transmission linkage has been partially disconnected. A couple of bolts were removed and replaced with shorter ones that would hold under normal conditions but fail under load. This isn't wear and tear. This is sabotage." The repair bill was $8,000, money I didn't have. Worse, I'd missed another delivery appointment, triggering more penalty clauses. My perfect safety record was being destroyed by incidents that weren't accidents at all. That's when I started keeping detailed records of everything. Every stop, every person who approached my truck, every unusual occurrence, no matter how minor. I also installed a hidden security camera in my cab that would record anyone who came near my truck while I was away. The camera paid off 2 weeks later at a truck stop in Arkansas. The footage showed a man in coveralls approaching my truck around 2 a.m., crawling underneath with a flashlight and tools, and working on something for about 10 minutes before disappearing. When I examined my truck the next morning, I found fresh tool marks on my fuel lines and evidence that someone had loosened my drive belt tensioner. I took the footage to the FBI field office in Little Rock. Agent Sarah Chen listened to my story and reviewed my documentation with increasing concern. "You're not the first owner-operator to report systematic sabotage," she told me. "We've had similar complaints from drivers across the Midwest, all involving high-value automotive freight." The investigation that followed uncovered a sophisticated industrial espionage operation that had been targeting independent truckers for months. The scheme involved employees at several major logistics companies who were feeding information about valuable loads to criminal crews tasked with disrupting competitor operations. The goal wasn't just theft, it was economic warfare. By causing mechanical failures, missed deliveries, and safety violations, they could force independent operators out of business and drive freight contracts back to the major carriers who were paying for the sabotage. The operation was run by Marcus Delano, a former trucking company executive who'd been fired for embezzlement 3 years earlier. He'd recruited a network of mechanics, truck stop employees, and logistics workers who could identify high-value loads and gain access to trucks for sabotage operations. Delano's crew would target independent operators specifically because they lacked the resources to absorb repeated mechanical failures and missed deliveries. A major carrier might write off a few $1,000s in penalties as the cost of doing business, but for an owner-operator, those same penalties could mean bankruptcy. The mechanics in Delano's network were particularly insidious. They'd get jobs at truck stops and repair facilities along major freight corridors, giving them legitimate access to hundreds of trucks every week. They could sabotage vehicles during routine maintenance, making the damage appear accidental, or they could slip away from their duties to tamper with parked trucks. The investigation revealed that my truck had been targeted because I'd won several lucrative contracts away from a major carrier that was part of Delano's network. Every load I hauled successfully was money they weren't making, so they decided to eliminate the competition through sabotage. Over 6 months, federal agents gathered evidence of sabotage operations affecting more than 40 independent truckers across 8 states. The total economic damage exceeded $2.3 million, and several drivers had been forced out of business entirely. Delano and 14 members of his network were eventually arrested on federal charges including conspiracy, interstate commerce interference, and sabotage of commercial vehicles. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Recorded phone conversations, financial records showing payments to mechanics for special services, and even video footage of sabotage operations. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that the scheme had been operating for over 2 years, with Delano's network systematically targeting any independent operator who posed a competitive threat to their client companies. They'd caused dozens of accidents, hundreds of mechanical failures, and had driven at least 12 owner-operators into bankruptcy. Delano received 15 years in federal prison. The mechanics and logistics employees received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement. But for me, the damage was already done. The repeated mechanical failures and missed deliveries had destroyed my credit rating and cost me my major contracts. My insurance premiums tripled after the incidents, and several potential customers refused to work with a driver who had a record of reliability issues. I managed to keep my truck, but I had to take lower-paying regional runs while rebuilding my reputation. It took almost 2 years to recover financially from the sabotage campaign, and I'm still dealing with the psychological effects. Every unusual sound from my engine makes me paranoid. Every mechanic who works on my truck gets a thorough background check. I've installed multiple security cameras, tamper-evident seals on all critical systems, and I never leave my truck unattended at unfamiliar locations. The experience taught me that in the modern trucking industry, competition isn't just about who can haul freight most efficiently. Sometimes it's about who's willing to cross legal and ethical lines to eliminate their rivals. These days, I'm part of a network of independent operators who share security information and watch out for each other. We've learned that the American dream of owning your own truck And building a successful business comes with risks that go far beyond mechanical failures and highway accidents. Because sometimes, the biggest threat to your livelihood isn't the road ahead. It's the people behind you who will do anything to make sure you never reach your destination.